United States Ambassador to the United Nations, a great friend, Andrew Young.
You couldn't blame people for feeling the way they did. They had been taught that way. One of the things that it was my job to do was to help them understand that all people were children of God.
Nobody told us that the way would be easy, but I don't believe he brought us this far to leave us.
Well, good afternoon and welcome. I am Tamikia Milton, Clinical Pastoral Education Supervisor and Chaplain with the Johns Hopkins Health System. And we are thoroughly delighted to welcome you to When Faith and Race Unite, the role of the faith community in bridging the racial divide. Joining me is my co-facilitator and moderator, Mr. Selwyn Ray.
Very happy to be here now in person and in voice. I have an august body of individuals before us, and this entire activity will elevate every aspect of the community that is engaged. We're very happy. Thank you, Pastor Milton, for that invitation to begin this process. And I must say that this is a wonderful opportunity for us, even in the midst of this time of great challenge, to become transformative agents of healing, a word that we don't misuse, but we use because it's possible. With this great interfaith body before us, we will transform individuals, and we look forward to moving forward. This is the first webinar to kick off our week-long Martin Luther King commemoration, and we wanted to begin it this week with an in-depth discussion on faith and racism, and we will do so. Sister Tamikia?
Thank you, Selwyn. The opening film clip sets the tone for our discussion today, and we'll hear more from the interview with Bishop T.D. Jakes and Ambassador Andrew Young. It is important to note that before Dr. King became a civil rights icon, he was an ordained preacher of the gospel, as was Ambassador Young. So today's focus is on the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a man of faith. Themes such as grace, love, solidarity, compassion, forgiveness, and healing are theological realities that fostered the ministry of Reverend King and was harnessed in his belly, to which transcended to his message and view of the beloved community, where people are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Dr. King's embodied faith fueled the flame of every message, and his stance depicted that the time is always right to do what is right. So on today, in the spirit of faith and in the spirit of the holy, we will continue to lead in our conversation and dialogue.
Wonderful. And joining us, Sister Milton, are 5, I consider actually 6, brilliant people, because the 6th is the Spirit of God that combines them all together. Initially, and we're going to understand the limited amount of time that we have, but I will state the names of the individuals, and then we'll ask each individual panelist to embark on expressing who they are to the audience in a simple sentence or two. No reading of bios because we'll soon know who they are by their answers to their questions. But I'll begin with the wonderful Dr. Alvin Hathaway, pastor of the Union Baptist Church. Please, sir.
Thank you, Reverend Brelwin, and all my colleagues. If just to say myself, August of 1963, the Great March on Washington. I was a young kid, and July of 1963, a beneficiary of the work of clergy here in this city, I was able to go into Gwynn Oak Park that was desegregated. That really capsulized why, because I'm the direct beneficiary of the hard work of our ancestors.
Beautiful thought. Thank you again. And I refer to you as wonderful. So now I'm going to refer to Dr. Tamara Wilson, pastor of the New Season, New Day Church, as wonderful. Express yourself, please, ma'am.
Good morning, and thank you for having me this morning. I am so excited to participate in this conversation. I'd just like to introduce myself as the pastor of New Season, New Day, and I also serve as the chair of the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pastor. Wonderful Rabbi Daniel Berg, Beth Am Synagogue. Please, sir, shalom.
Hi, good to see everybody. In 1963, I would not be born for more than a decade, but I'm really delighted to be here to celebrate the legacy of Dr. King. I've had the pleasure of knowing a number of the co-panelists today, and so I want to thank you for allowing me to sit with you on this august occasion. And I'm the rabbi at Beth Am Synagogue in Reservoir Hill in central West Baltimore, a congregation that strives to be in, for, and of its majority Black neighborhood.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Wonderful Father Joseph Muth, pastor of the Blessed Sacrament Church. Please take your mute off, sir. Thank you.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Good day. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It's very inspiring to do that. I'm the pastor of two churches in Northeast Baltimore, St. Matthew Catholic Church on Lock Raven Boulevard and Blessed Sacrament Catholic Church on Old York Road. And I'm grateful to be here with you all today. One of the things in my heart has always been Dr. King's talking about the beloved community. And I've tried to keep that focus when I've been pastoring these two churches or any churches I've pastored to help them to create and recreate that image in our relationships with each other. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Father. Thank you so much. Our wonderful Sister Zainab Chaudhry, Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Please, my sister.
Thank you so much. And it's great to be here today with all of you. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation, and I really look forward to what everybody has to offer. My name is Zainab Chaudhry. I'm the Director of CARE's office here in Maryland. CARE is a Council on American Islamic Relations. We are America's largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization. And in line with the spirit of Dr. King and the work that he has provided for our country for generations to come, really his legacy speaks true to my heart. I'm a proud daughter of immigrants, unapologetic Muslim, a daughter of Baltimore, born and raised in the city. Very proud to champion social justice issues and civil rights issues for all of our diverse communities to make sure that our coming generations can truly appreciate and recognize the legacy that Dr. King paved for my generation of leaders as well. So thank you for hosting this and allowing me to be part of this conversation.
Thank you. Sister Tamikia, you want to go ahead after we see this wonderful clip? Well, I think what happened was we saw the opening clip of Andrew Young. So what we're going to do is look deeper into that, where he stated that all people are children of God. Tamikia?
Yes, we'll move forward with this. In the opening clip, Ambassador Young stated that all people are children of God. And based on your beliefs, the question is, do you believe that is true? And if it is true, how can the faith community help us to see people of different races, ethnicities, social demographics as their neighbor, as a beloved child of God in this day and time?
And I believe.
And I would invite you, Father Mute.
Sure, yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, the seeing people, my fellow brothers and sisters, as children of God. I think that's a true statement. Everybody is a child of God, although there may be different interpretations of the way we express that in our own religious tradition. And but I wonder if, even though I, from my perspective and my denominational perspective, see people as child of God, whether everybody sees themselves that way.
Mhm.
And if people do not see themselves that way, how do we enter into relationship with people to help them understand that gift that they are, just having life itself, that God is with them in a particular way? They might not feel that they're a child of God, maybe because of the way they've been treated by some religious community, or maybe by the way they've experienced difficulties in life. They might figure, how could God love me? But one of our jobs or ministries or ways of reaching out to people is to break through that barrier, I think, and to help people recognize their beauty and their essence as a child of God. In my lifetime, one of the things that I was able to do, I spent 9 years as a pastor of St. Anne's Church in Baltimore City. St. Anne's was a church on Greenmount Avenue in Baltimore, and it had a lot of crime, a lot of drugs in the community. It was an African-American community, and most of the time I was the only white person at church meetings and services and neighborhood gatherings. So it was my being surrounded by people of another culture and another expression of faith to help me understand what my relationship was as me as a child of God, much less having people from a different culture that I was a part of teaching me their own experience of life. Now, St. Anne was only 5 miles from where I grew up, but I'd never been there until I was assigned there as pastor. So it was a very unique experience for me, and them teaching me about what life is all about from their perspective. I had to learn somewhat new ways to preach, and I had to learn new understandings of life. I had to learn new expressions. I even had to learn some new music, but it was entering into that part of another people's experience that helped me to learn about that. And then at St. Matthew, where I am now, we've made a concerted effort to reach out to, we have a relationship with Baltimore Hebrew congregation and Har Sinai congregation, the Jewish community. We also have reached out to the Al Rahma Mosque in West Baltimore and the Ahmadiyya Mosque in East Baltimore. And because of that, we've made good relationships with some of those congregations and mosques and temples. And many people in the church tell me that they're so happy that we do that because they want their children to learn about different mosques, synagogues, temples from their own experience. They don't want their children to be only influenced by what they see on television. They wanted to meet people themselves and have their own personal relational development, help them come to terms with recognizing people as equal and as children of God from different denominations and different understandings of faith. So we work on that pretty clearly along the way throughout the year. So I'll stop right there for the current time, and somebody else can pick up from there.
Sure. I really appreciate that. That the starting point of really treating someone as a child of God is really seeing yourself as a child of God, and that awareness and how it informs our engagement of our neighbor and with the other. Any other panelists would like to respond?
I'd like to jump in there and say
Yes,
something. I think it is absolutely true that everyone is a child of God. And the way that the faith community can help broaden the community, seeing people with different skin tones and different backgrounds, different lifestyles as a fellow child of God, is to accept the fact that children of God come in different skin tones. They come from different backgrounds. They have different lifestyles. They have different beliefs. We help each other see that everyone is a child of God in our own acceptance and inclusion of different people in our teachings and in our daily practices.
Thank you, Pastor Tamara. So there seems to be an etiquette in which we model that really begins to help us to care for ourselves and care for others as children of God and live that out. Thank you. Selwyn?
Yes, those were wonderful answers, and they contextualize, I think, the next area we're going into. We're about to go to the second clip from our Ambassador Andrew Young, and this will lead us to our next question. And we're about to see the clip.
I grew up in a neighborhood that made me an ambassador at 4 years old. There was an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on another, the German American Bund, the headquarters of the Nazi Party, was on the third corner, and they were Highland Hitler there in the 30s, and because there was no air conditioning, so they kept the windows open. And so I was walking by there regularly at 3 and 4 years old, and my father told me, he said, "These are white supremacists, and white supremacy is a sickness, and you don't get upset with sick people. You know that God made of one blood all the nations of the world. They don't know that, and they are trying to say that they are better than everybody else, but that's their sickness, not yours." And he said, "Don't ever get afraid. Don't ever get angry. When you get angry, the blood rushes from your head to your fist or your feet, and you'll either run or fight, and then you'll be ashamed of yourself for either one." And said, if you can stay calm and use your mind will lead you through difficulties that your fist or your feet will never get you out of. And it turned out that has been true.
Very well. And that's a remarkable lead-in by the good ambassador. And I see Father Muse smiling, and I appreciate Pastor Wilson's contextualizing again of this notion. We speak of all children being of God, yet we have this construct of this notion of white supremacy. And I would just like to ask the panelists to talk about that notion of white supremacy and it being, as was stated, a sickness from the mouths of several people, King as well as the ambassador, but how can we move that forward into this positive transformation with that language lingering in the background? One of the panelists?
I'll be happy to jump in. I was blessed in that I was born in the 1200 block of Drill Avenue. That is the same block in which the church that I serve, which is Union Baptist Church. Union Baptist Church is entering its 169th year of service. It has had an illustrious and amazing career dealing with the issue of white supremacy and racial equality. It has had and I was the beneficiary of that. What I would say is that I do know Ambassador Young. I have had a number of conversations with him. I remember one conversation in specific. He was the mayor now of Atlanta, and he dressed up with a knit cap over his head. He had placed on a coat so you couldn't tell that he was the mayor. And he went to a feeding homeless shelter where they were feeding people. And he discovered that because they could not distinguish who he was, they would not admit him. And he left there incensed. Here I am, the mayor of Atlanta, and I couldn't get fed looking like I was a person that was homeless going to a feeding shelter. The challenge of white supremacy is, and I just use that because I want to use his words, is that it is more than a sickness. It is a construct. And one of the things that we have found at Union Baptist Church, had an amazing pastor. He was the fifth pastor of Union. His name was Reverend Dr. Harvey Johnson. He should be lauded throughout our city because he understood that he had to work to break down that construct of white supremacy. 1883 sued the Sioux Steamship Line, which allowed for persons now who were of color not to be considered cargo in interstate commerce. Sued the B&O Railroad in 1906 because they had segregated cars. Continued on to my predecessor, Reverend Dr. Vernon Dobson, who literally understood that we needed to create in our community the relationships so that we could work together. And so in 77 began, and I was part of that early effort, to put together what we now know as BUILD, Baltimore's United in Leadership Development. It was to break down these constructs where Baltimore led with restrictive covenants, where if you were a person of color or you were a person of Jewish heritage, you couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. So it's more than a sickness. And I think that when we look at Martin Luther King, we got to also look at the person who grew up in the who lived in the 1300 block of Drew Hill Avenue, and that was Clarence Mitchell Jr., who was the 100th senator, who understood that we had to dismantle the legal constructs that made white supremacy, gave it its power.
Thank you, Pastor. I'm going to ask another panelist, maybe Zainab or others, to speak, but I wanted to put this in a little deeper context. We heard the reference to sickness, and I'm reminded of one of our noted founders of Johns Hopkins, William Osler. He has a wonderful quote that states that he doesn't want to know the disease when dealing with sickness, but he wants to know the person with the disease. And I'd like, as we move further into this, to think about getting beyond indicting and getting to the true healing of individuals by even using that concept that Dr. Osler used a while. Not knowing the person only, but understanding the disease and the person together. And then we can deal with some form of positive transformation. I didn't know whether anybody else, Zainab, did you have anything you wanted to add? You have to be unmuted. You'll be, there you are.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. No, thank you so much. That's a powerful perspective to share. The fact that this is not just a sickness. Our country is in the middle of two pandemics right now. We're in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic that is a year old, but the pandemic of racism and white supremacy that's sweeping our country is over 400 years old. And I reflect back last year to the high profile murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many other individuals who've been impacted by this pandemic and the toll that it's taken, especially on African-American communities in our country. And the fact that this construct, like my dear colleague here mentioned, Dr. Hathaway mentioned, this construct has really kind of cultivated this belief that this ideology, these thoughts and these actions are superior of white people to people of color. When we talk about what the implications of this construct is within our society, it has impacted our political, economic, cultural system in so many different ways. And as our country is still, in the aftermath of this assault on our republic last week that's taken the country by storm, our faith provides a very kind of critical sort of balancing point for our country to be able to come back to seeing each other beyond these artificial constructs to the core of who we actually are. From the Islamic faith perspective, Islam flat out rejects these ideologies that lead to a false sense of superiority. In his final sermon, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said there is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab, or a non-Arab over an Arab, no superiority of a white person over a Black person, or of a Black person over a white person, except by their piety and righteousness. And I think when we come back to, who the essence of our being is, the piety and the shared humanity that we all have, looking beyond these artificial constructs, then truly can we begin to heal collectively and make reconciliation to those communities, especially African-American communities who historically have been disproportionately impacted by this sickness.
Thank you so much, panelists. Tamikia, I think we're going to another clip.
Sure. It's a great segue into when we're talking about reconciliation, restoration, healing, forgiveness. This leads to our next clip where Andrew Young is acknowledging that his wife and Mrs. Coretta Scott King grew up together. And he tells of an incident in Coretta's life as a teen. So let's take a look at this clip.
My wife and Coretta both suffered Coretta's house was burned down when she was 15. She'd been to choir practice and came home from choir practice to find the house burned to the ground. And her daddy, who was not a particularly well-educated man, but a man of great faith, had them all kneel down and said, first, thank God that none of them were home. And then he prayed for forgiveness for the sick people that burned their house down. And then he prayed that they would never hold any hatred or bitterness in their hearts.
What Coretta Scott King's father did after experiencing such tragedy is definitely almost unheard of today. When someone does wrong, we immediately want justice. There's very little talk of forgiveness. And quite frankly, many, especially members of the Black community, are saddened, hurt, disappointed, afraid, and outraged. So unfortunately, forgiveness for many, including believers, people of faith, is a challenge. So I would invite the panel to speak to us on why forgiveness is necessary, and also balance it with the need of seeing justice served when someone has been wronged.
So I guess I will address that. I want to start off by saying that forgiveness is the foundation of the Christian faith. God forgave, therefore we forgive. So forgiveness is absolutely necessary. However, there is a balance to forgiveness. Forgiveness calls for the one who was wronged to make an active decision to let go of the wrong that was inflicted upon them, thus releasing the one who wronged them from the guilt of what they had done. The balance of forgiveness, of forgiving, is this: making an active decision to let go of the wrong that was inflicted upon you does not mean accepting the wrong, which amounts to nothing more than condoning or excusing the wrong. Therefore, to bridge any kind of racial divide or to achieve the racial harmony and unity that we say we so desire, forgiveness must add to its equation reconciliation. The restoring, the bringing back together, or the repairing of the breach. It is not enough for us to preach and teach forgiveness, to turn the other cheek, to let go, to forgive, lest you become bitter, and it turns you into someone else that you are not. Well, we've all preached that. But we must preach and teach the balance that when you have wronged someone, you are to seek to be reconciled with the one that you've wronged. In seeking reconciliation, restitution has to be made to make things right. So when one truly seeks to reconcile the wrong, they have perpetuated against someone or perpetrated on someone. You have to recognize that a transaction must be made to correct the wrong. Otherwise, when you wrong someone, in the words of the 22-year-old who attacked the 14-year-old last week or last month, you are in fact saying, I said I'm sorry. Now we just need to move on. So we, the faith community, have to teach and preach the balance of both forgiveness and reconciliation if harmony is to truly be reached.
Thank you, Pastor Tara. Rabbi Berg, you were going to.
Yeah, I'd love to build on what Reverend Wilson just said, which I think was so important. Whether it's the act of arson that's being described in the video, or the incursion at the Capitol this past week, where we saw the most kind of virulent strain of white supremacy in its most obvious form, the storming of the Capitol building, the flying of the Confederate banner, T-shirt that's said Camp Auschwitz, right? Hate on full display. I agree that while forgiveness is laudable and in many cases aspirational, in order to get to forgiveness, there is work that has to be done. In the Jewish tradition, we certainly believe that God is a forgiving God, but we also say that sins committed against God are between us and God. Sins committed against human beings, is really between us and those human beings. And so we have to seek forgiveness. We have to ask forgiveness. And in doing that, as was said, there's a process, right, of repair. We call it tshuva, of turning or returning, of recalibrating, of coming to maybe the same situation and making a different and better choice. If we can demonstrate that repentance, having done the difficult work of making amends, then we have a right to ask for forgiveness. Then the question, of course, becomes, what about the person who was harmed? Do they have an obligation to forgive? In our tradition, in the Jewish tradition, the answer to that is actually no, the first time. So if someone comes and asks for forgiveness, again, having done the work, not simply saying, oh, what I did was just fine, but would you forgive me? But having done the work of repair, if that person is unable to forgive the first time, that's okay. The second time, the same. If by the third time that person has sought forgiveness, at that point, the harmed person is really supposed to forgive. And if they don't, our tradition says that they have then committed some measure of a sin themselves. In other words, there is the continuation of grievances that can become kind of a force in and of itself and can be degrading for individuals and degrading for communities and for societies. So I'll give you just one final example. The positivity rate for COVID-19 in Maryland this week is, I don't know, somewhere between 8 and 9% right now, I think, right? Think about how much damage 8 to 9% positivity rate is able to do to our society. How many people are getting sick? How many people are dying, right? Disproportionately Black and brown Marylanders, but disease, obviously doesn't discriminate either. The healthcare system does. So think about that 8 or 9% now. If 9% of human beings, right, 9% of Marylanders forgave when there was cause to forgive, how much good could be spread throughout the society? Right? That also is a communicable thing, but not an illness. It's actually a salve. It's actually a sort of inoculation against hate. And so I think forgiveness is something that ought to be done. We ought not to judge people who have difficulty forgiving because it's hard to stand in somebody else's place. But where we can forgive, much can come about, much good can come about because of it.
This theme of forgiveness is so important as we look toward healing and hope. And I mentioned earlier this etiquette, if you will, but there's also an ethic that I hear being resound from all the faith traditions represented, that there's a way in which we practice this, and there's an intentionality that must be endeavored when we are practicing forgiveness. Did anyone else, this is such a rich topic, especially about forgiveness, because, and I go back to what Pastor Tamara said, that there's this ebb and flow of acknowledgement in order for the forgiveness to really transcend from a genuine and authentic place. And so I want to invite and see if there were any of our panelists that wanted to expound a little more on this idea of forgiveness and the importance of forgiveness and the balance needed.
I'd love to just add on to what Rabbi Berg mentioned. I mean, it was a powerful reflection from the Jewish faith tradition. Thank you so much, Rabbi Berg, for sharing that. From the Islamic perspective, forgiveness is not an obligation, but it's a virtue. And in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God tells us, if you pardon and overlook and forgive their faults, then God is truly all forgiving, most merciful. And similar to how we seek forgiveness from God for our sins, similarly, we're encouraged to also forgive those who have wronged us. When the New Zealand massacre occurred that took the lives of 51 Muslim congregants who were praying the Friday prayer, some of the family members of the victims came forward and they wanted to share that they forgave the shooters who came into those mosques and who committed that terrible attack. At the same time, there are some people who say, well, I'm sorry is just an excuse to do the same thing over and over again. And so there needs to be a demonstrable desire to seek restitution from those who are perpetrating these horrific attacks or these crimes against other people, in order to ensure that this is not a pattern that it is perpetuated. Justice is also a very important core concept within our faith tradition, and where Muslims are instructed firmly to stand out firmly for justice, whether it be against ourselves or against others or against anybody who has been wronged. And so marrying these two concepts together, I think, is really where we can move forward when it comes to healing from a faith perspective.
Thank you. I think it's so important to recognize that piece, that when we're talking about forgiveness, it's not, oh, I'm sorry. But even as Rabbi, you acknowledge repentance, that when we repent, there's a change. And so there should be a recognizable change in the acts that were done, warranting forgiveness. Thank you. Selwyn?
Yes, I agree, Pastor Milton. The rabbi's notion of inoculating a community, essentially what he said was with love and with forgiveness, is a wonderful concept. As we now move to our final clip, I think it's going to be momentous to see how we take this incident that Ambassador Young participated in, and that is the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. I visited Tennessee a few years back, but my heart and stomach wouldn't allow me to go near that motel. I drove by it, but I still feel touched in my heart from that experience. Let's watch this clip and see what we feel.
I want to talk about Dr. King for a moment. You're probably one of the few people left who really, really knew him well. Best friends, you might say, with Dr. King. You all traveled around the world. I heard you went to Jerusalem.
Well, Ralph was his best friend, Ralph Abernathy. I carried his bag, and then I was the errand boy.
You were the errand boy. Okay. You went to Jerusalem with him.
Yeah.
You were with him in Jerusalem. You were with him on the balcony that fatal day when he was shot. Can you take us there and tell us what was going on before and what it was like in that moment when they shot him?
I think from the time he was 25 on, he was ready, knew that every day could be his last. Martin had no choice. The Lord took him home when he was 39. But he used to say, whenever my time comes, I'm ready. He said, but we got 100 years of work to do here. And if none of us will probably make it past 40. But if we make it past 40, we got to keep going to 100, because we have a long way to go to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty.
But you were on the balcony when that happened, and you're one of the few people who was there. What was it like to be there?
I grew up looking at death as a blessing, not a curse or a burden, because my grandmama looked at it as salvation.
Okay.
And I thought of my grandmother when I saw Martin. But it's a funny emotion, but I got mad with him. I said, you can't go to heaven and leave us in hell. Mm. And then I realized that the bullet that hit his chin severed his spinal cord, and he probably didn't hear anything or feel anything. And then I decided that it was a beautiful way to die, and that he would not die, that his spirit would live with us as long as we were alive, and could tell his story and try to replicate his life. And I think that's the case. I hardly make a move or do anything or even think anything without remembering something he said.
That was a remarkable expression from a remarkable ambassador. I'm reminded of the fact that race and faith have been intertwined in this country, specifically for many years. But I'm also refreshed and inspired by the fact that we have a new generation of spirituality, where not only are they taking their faith, but they're also dealing with race and going beyond the separations of skin color and moving us towards a collective, a new generation of accountability and responsibility. And I think that's the beauty of what happens with all of these religions that we express here when we elevate our consciousness and get into that inoculation that the good rabbi spoke of. But I want to ask, as we wind down and soon open up the chat room for some questions, I want to ask all of our faith leaders, what are their heart thoughts on that occurrence, that death that occurred to Dr. King, where his head was blown off, essentially. How can our how can our faith, avoid the word hate, how can our faith help us to heal in those sort of moments when bad things like this, extremely bad, if you ask me, to what we consider good people? So I would ask the faith leaders to dig deep into your faith tradition and help us to move forward into the chat and do some further healing and reconciling.
I'll jump in.
Please.
3 elements. Think about a family, think about a community in terms of its school, you think about a first community in terms of its tentacles. So 1963, President Kennedy is assassinated. I was in school. School helped interpret that. Went to the family. Family helped interpret that. Went to the church. The church helped understand that. 1967, Malcolm X is killed. School talked about that. Family discussed that. Church talked about that. 1968, now Martin Luther King is assassinated. School talked about that. And at that time, I was a minority group in Baltimore City College. So it was one of the fully integrated schools in our city. Talked about that. Family talked about that. And then, of course, at our church, we discussed that. One of the challenges of our times is that those building blocks are weakened significantly, where our schools are pretty much segregated. Our families are challenged. And many times the networks and tentacles of our faith community do not extend into the community. So when something happens, those support systems aren't in place for people to help them interpret what's going on. And I think that even as we talk about Martin Luther King and talk about assassinations happen every time. This modern era is looking at police assassinations of Black people, and they don't have a way of processing that and understanding that. So I think when you think about faith, faith has to make certain that it is in the public square. It has to make certain that it is supporting families. It's got to make certain that it's impacting schools so that people can process what's happening in our life and times and communities at this, in our particular time.
Thank you, Pastor. Anyone else? Please, faith leaders.
I'll jump in after Dr. Hathaway. I grew up in Baltimore City, the east side of the city, post-King assassination time, a time when Black people were redefining themselves in search of a new and more positive identity than the negative ones that had been assigned to them by others. The use of Black or African-American was embraced over a Negro or colored. Creative uses of language, natural hairstyles, and ethnic fashions were ways to self-identify in a racist culture. And in the midst of all of this, it was reinforced, piggybacking on what Dr. Hathaway said, it was reinforced by family members and teachers who lived through the turbulence of the civil rights movement, that there were Black people, both men and women, who had taken a stand and refused to be moved. They were threatened, beaten, lynched, fired, put out of school, and in some cases, in many cases, they died. All of that provided the way for the opportunities that I, as a young Black girl growing up in East Baltimore, had the opportunity to do. So my faith in God informs me that it rains on the just and the unjust. It tells me that evil, no matter how long it takes, it will not prevail. Therefore, no matter what happens, no matter what comes, the fight for equity and against injustice, whatever that injustice may be, the fight for it must continue on. And so I believe that we have to begin to share those kinds of stories with others so that they too may be able to move forward in recognizing that we can heal even though bad things happen. We can move on and we can still do the right thing in the midst of others doing the wrong.
Thank you, Pastor Wilson. Others, please. Rabbi, Father.
So, I mean, I was sort of awestruck by listening to the ambassador reflect on having been there and his experience. I will say, I do think that this is a place where Jewish tradition departs from Christian ways of thinking about death and suffering. For me, I could describe beautiful deaths. I've witnessed beautiful deaths. I personally can't conceptualize Dr. King's murder as a beautiful death. And you know, when I think about that phrase that you used, Selwyn, about you know, when bad things happen to good people. So Rabbi Harold Kushner actually wrote a book by that title. It was a bestseller. And Rabbi Kushner argues that, you know, God's presence is not to be found in, you know, deplorable acts of violence. God's presence is to be found in the response to those deplorable acts, right? I have no doubt that God was with Dr. King. I cannot believe that God was with the shooter, right? I cannot believe that God was with the mob that attacked the Capitol building, or with Donald Trump when he puts in place a ban on Muslims, or with another murderer who goes into a church and shoots people simply because they're Black, right? So my faith tradition would say that those are not acts of God, that God's presence is in how we learn, how we respond, how we grow, and how we better ourselves. There are opportunities now in this moment to do work. Dr. King spoke of 100 years of work that needs to be done. By my count, going from when he said that, we've still got over 50 to go. I wish I could say that I believe that 50 years from now we'll have sorted it out, but in the next 50 years, let's get to work, because it's never okay to take a weapon and cut somebody down.
Very well, Rabbi. I want to hear from Father Muth.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, thank you very much. I also like to follow up with what Rabbi Berg said, because I think in response to Dr. King's death, with the many riots that occurred in different cities throughout the nation, if you talk about what happened in Baltimore, many of the churches and synagogues came together as religious institutions to help heal their communities, whether it was providing food for people who couldn't get to the store, whether it was helping people feel that they were safe, whether it was dealing with the people's fear because the National Guard was on the streets. Many of the churches came together to run errands to help people feel safe. So if you're talking about, when Rabbi Berg was talking about the response of people is the response of God's action in our communities, I think that's one of the ways in which we see that happening, not so much in the violent action that takes place, but in the response that helps the communities to heal, come together, deal with the fears, and learn to trust that the religious communities can have a positive effect in dangerous and worrisome times. Even like last week, I think the religious community is going to have a great deal of work to do as a response to what took place in Washington last week. And hopefully we can begin to do some of that with a panel like this.
Thank you, Father.
Yes, thank you. So we have a question, and I want to thank Zanab.
Zanab.
Okay, it's not a problem. I guess just to add on to what has already been profoundly said, the idea that something so tragic and so horrific could have anything positive come from it or ever be framed as a beautiful act almost defies logic and reason. And so we rely on faith in those times to try to understand what is the wisdom behind these incidents and what can we collectively and individually learn from them. And I know in the Quran, like God tells us that he does not burden the soul beyond what it can bear, and that we might dislike something, but there is some benefit to it. And we might like something and there is some harm in it. And God knows better than we do. And when I think about how the horrific tragedy of the murder of this icon, legendary icon, who literally paved the way for civil rights in our country, not even in our country, but globally in many ways, the idea that galvanized a movement that led to transformative change is really, I think, something that adds to the legacy of Dr. King. The fact that children of all backgrounds, of all races and religions across the world know who Dr. King is. Would that have been possible if the circumstances had been different? Was it worth the sacrifice? I think that's not our answer to give. I think that's something that Dr. King and his family could answer that question more effectively. But the fact that his sacrifice at a time when people were trying to silence him actually ended up galvanizing his passion and commitment for social justice and change within our communities is something that is remarkable and speaks for itself as a lesson, especially for future generations as we move forward in the work for social justice within our country.
Thank you, Zanab. And again, pardon me, I didn't mean to interrupt. We would like to move to questions. We've received a few, and I will pose this first one. And it says, "A riot is the language of the unheard." This is a quote by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And so the question is, I understand that the conversation was centered around healing and forgiveness. However, I think an aspect of Martin Luther King's teaching that is oftentimes under discussed is that he also was an advocate for radical forms of resistance. Historically, faith-based, so-called violent resistant movements have always taken place from Denmark Vesey to Nat Turner for oppressed groups to fight back against oppression. Can the panelists discuss how their respective faiths feel about resistant movements and how faith can be used to encourage forgiveness, but to also evoke rebellion?
How do you respond to that? The best way to respond to that is what we also saw that same week of the Capitol. We saw a Baptist preacher who occupies the pulpit of Ebenezer through his work and struggle, now go to the halls of Congress as a U.S. Senator from Georgia. That is one of the strongest forms of resistance, is to say that not only can I advocate from outside about change within, I can be within and advocate change that impact those without. And that's been the uniqueness of the faith community, has been that it's been able to do both and. It's been able to be outside and critique and to challenge, but it's also to be inside like Ambassador Young, emerge and operate from inside like a Warnock, like a Adam Clayton Powell, like a continuing on and on. Those that have been inside that have advocated out. Our own Perrin Mitchell and others. So I just think Elijah Cummings and others. So it's the beauty of faith that we aren't trapped to one form of resistance. It is both and.
Yeah, and I think the resistance that Dr. King taught, at least what I got from his teaching, the clearest, strongest resistance is the action of nonviolence, because violence is expected in many situations. You're supposed to be an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's what's normally understood is going to happen. But Dr. King frequently talked about the power of nonviolence, and through his own organization, taught people nonviolent resistance. And that has a moral attitude about it that can overcome the actual violence that takes place. So I think we need to really explore what that nonviolent resistance is all about, because I think that's an important thing. And Dr. King always talked about too, a redemptive suffering, that when you do this kind of nonviolent resistance, redemptive suffering means that suffering has a meaning and a purpose. We don't always explore that, but we need to kind of try to explore that to understand what the nonviolent resistance is all about.
I think it's
Yeah,
important
think
for us
that
to, I think it's also important for us to look at where we are today. We are today in this country, we are in the middle of the nation's largest uprising that it has ever seen. We have to be careful in calling protests and things like that riots, because just because someone comes together or a group of people come together to protest against something does not mean that it is a riot. So we have to watch our language. Our language kind of takes us into a different kind of connotation of what this what the discussion about revolting is. So I think that's what's happening here in the country now is a sign of revolt. People are rising up against the injustices that we are facing in this country.
Yeah, I think Reverend is exactly right about that. And just as it's important to call uprisings and protests. For example, the Black Lives Matter protest that the president gassed in order to have a photo op. It's also important to call a riot or an incursion what that is, right? And the Capitol building this week on Wednesday was exactly that. That was an act of white supremacist domestic terrorism. I suspect what Dr. King meant when he spoke about riots being the language of the unheard is to try to sort of allow us to be more empathic with one another, right? I think that was a statement about empathy. He of course, as Father Moose said, was committed to nonviolence his entire life and taught that. But he understood the rage. He understood why there would be people who would break windows and set things on fire when it just sort of boils up inside you, and you feel like you have no faith in a society. So why should you not bother, right? We had Greg Butler, who at Beth Am this past Yom Kippur, one of the people featured in Wes Moore's book, 5 Days. And he was the one, if you remember, who infamously cut the fire hose during the Baltimore uprising in 2015. And he talked about how he's sort of grown from that moment. But if you read the book and you listen to him, you understand how he came to that moment. And I think that's what Dr. King was talking about. We need more empathy, and we especially need more empathy for people of color, communities of color, who have been placed in a disadvantaged position by white supremacist majority rule for so long that sometimes that's going to come out in some unhealthy ways. I doubt any of us on this call would endorse violence, but hopefully everybody tuning in can understand it a little better.
And the one point I think I'd like to add, I know we're running short on time. The one point I think I'd like to add to that is the fact that when we resist against a system that is rooted in injustices, that is founded on white supremacy, that has been designed to systematically denigrate and to systematically marginalize specific groups of people, especially communities of color, then resistance is not only justified, but it's also encouraged. I think many people, when we talk about the sanitized legacy of Dr. King that we learn in schools, we forget that he was a radical reformist who actually was targeted by the FBI because of his transformative views. And when we talk about what justice looks like, we have to also acknowledge the framework within which we're having these conversations and the system that, the laws that are enshrined in white supremacy. How do we move beyond that to actually look at justice in a more holistic way?
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I want to very briefly thank the astute panelists for giving of yourselves, your time, and your wisdom today. And I know you'll carry it forth. Each of you has inspired this great crowd of almost 200 people that listen into you to do better. I purposely put the pencil painting of Martin Luther King behind me purposely, because I wanted to remind us that he's no longer with us, but we're still here. And the rabbi reminds me when he spoke about that love inoculation, and I'm taking a little poetic license. You didn't necessarily say love inoculation, but I am. You spoke about empathy, and we speak about this notion of radical change and transformation. I would say to us, as we look to the 2 p.m. allyship webinar, don't forget that there's a battle going on within each of us. There's where the revolution, there's where the rebellion, there's where the change should happen. So if you want to take a step into changing our community, start within and even carry it to the person you see moments after this wonderful dialogue happens. You mentioned the word again, Rabbi, empathy, a word that some people think is soft and easy. It's one of the most powerful words in our vocabulary. So I think you've called us all, faith leaders, to look at our youth who have showed us what empathy means as they walked in the street together, male, female, white, black, every nationality you want to see. They're waking us up. And imagine what the 9 and 6 and 7-year-olds are waiting for. So in ending again, I'll say, please go to our allyship webinar too. And I want to personally thank Regina Gale Malloy and my wonderful co-facilitator for making this happen, and all those involved in the diaspora employee resource group. We look forward, we move forward, and I believe, Pastor, you had something you wanted to end on.
Well, thank you, Selwyn. And again, we would like to thank all of our guests and our panelists. And I'll conclude with these words from Dr. Michelle Obama. The work of truly repairing what is broken and or for our time of conversation today, bridging the racial divide, isn't the work of any individual, politician, or political party. It is up to each of us to do our part, to reach out, to listen, and to hold tight to the truth and values that have always led this country forward. It will be an uncomfortable and sometimes very painful process. But if we enter into it with an honest and unwavering love of our neighbor and community and country, then maybe we can finally start to heal. I hope that all of you will go in peace, being inspired and being blessed by the conversation and dialogue today. Thank you, and continue to engage in our week-long events commemorating the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you.
Peace, peace.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.